A veteran, escaping his past in a remote cabin, saved the life of an injured dog. But as he recovered, the dog didn't seek safety. Instead, he became obsessed with a distant mountain peak, urging the man to follow him. He wasn't running from something, he was on a mission. Trusting the animal, the veteran ventured into the wilderness, unaware that he was getting closer to a heartbreaking secret and a promise that had to be kept. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The city of Chicago breathed a relentless, metallic rhythm, a sound that Duke had come to associate with the slow grinding of his own soul. From his 14th-floor apartment, the world was a grid of steel and glass, a landscape of perpetual motion and noise. The shriek of the L train rounding the corner, the distant wail of a siren, the ceaseless hum of traffic, all of it seeped through the triple-paned windows and into the quiet corners of his mind. Duke stood before the vast window, his reflection a ghost superimposed over the glittering chaos below. At 34 years old, he had the lean, durable build of a man who had spent his youth pushing his body to its limits. His brown hair was cut short, a habit from his time in the service, and stubborn threads of silver were already making their claim at his temples. It was a rugged face, etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and a watchfulness that never truly faded. Yet there was a softness in his eyes, a deep well of kindness that seemed at odds with the tension in his jaw. He was a former Air Force pararescueman, a PJ. His life had once been defined by the roar of helicopter rotors, the focused adrenaline of a rescue hoist, and the profound, simple purpose of saving lives. Now, his days were dictated by shipping manifests and supply chain logistics. The work was stable, lucrative even. It paid for this sterile apartment with its minimalist furniture and empty walls. It paid for a life that, from the outside, looked like a success story. A veteran who had transitioned smoothly back into the civilian world. But it was a lie. The stability felt like stagnation. The quiet hum of his office felt louder than any combat zone. In the Air Force, every action had weight. Every decision mattered. Here, in the corporate world, the stakes were quarterly earnings and delivery timelines. The emptiness was a constant companion, a hollow echo in the space where his sense of purpose used to be. The city's noise was a constant trigger, each sudden sound a phantom limb from a past he could not outrun. For years he had saved. Each paycheck, a portion was siphoned off into an account he labeled simply escape. It was a long-held plan, an emergency exit he had meticulously prepared for a day he knew would eventually come, a day when the quiet desperation would finally become unbearable. That day was today. He turned from the window, his decision made not with a bang, but with a quiet, final sigh. There was no more debating, no more second-guessing. He moved through the apartment with the methodical efficiency of his training. He pulled a large, durable duffel bag from his closet. He packed not for a vacation, but for a deployment. Thermal layers, waterproof gear, thick wool socks, worn but reliable hiking boots. He added a comprehensive first aid kit, a multi-tool, a high-powered flashlight, and a well-cared-for survival knife. He was not running away unprepared. He paused in the kitchen, looking at the calendar on the wall. He had booked it months ago, a small, isolated cabin deep in the mountains of Colorado. A single red circle marked his arrival date. A 2-week rental in the middle of nowhere, a 2-week mission to find the silence he so desperately craved. The drive out of Chicago was a slow, deliberate exorcism. The skyscrapers receded in his rearview mirror, their sharp angles softening into the flat, expansive plains of the Midwest. For 2 days, he drove, the landscape gradually transforming. The flatlands gave way to rolling hills, which in turn swelled into the formidable, snow-dusted peaks of the Rocky Mountains. With every mile that passed, Duke felt a layer of the city's grime sloughing off. He kept the radio off, letting the low rumble of the pickup truck's engine be his only companion. He arrived in the small Colorado mountain town in the late afternoon. It was little more than a main street with a general store, a gas station, and a pub. He picked up the keys to the cabin from a lockbox at a small rental office, the instructions printed on a laminated card. The final leg of the journey took him up a winding gravel road, the truck's tires crunching in the quiet. The trees, tall ponderosa pines, grew thicker, swallowing the road and the last vestiges of civilization. Finally, he saw it. The cabin was exactly as the pictures had shown, a rustic structure of dark timber nestled in a clearing, a thin plume of smoke already rising from its stone chimney, a service the rental company provided for arriving guests. He pulled the truck to a stop, the engine's rumble dying with a final shudder. And then there was silence. It was absolute. A profound, deep quiet that was more than just the absence of noise. It was a living presence. There was no traffic, no sirens, no distant hum. There was only the whisper of the wind through the high branches of the pines and the soft crunch of his boots on the frost-covered ground as he stepped out of the truck. He tilted his head back, closing his eyes and breathing in the crisp, clean air. It was sharp and cold, and tasted of pine and earth. It tasted of peace. This was it. The silence he had traveled over 1,000 miles to find. He had arrived at his destination, the first step in a journey to find whatever was left of the man he used to be. The first morning in the cabin, Duke woke to a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. For years, his mornings had been heralded by the jarring blast of an alarm clock, followed immediately by the symphony of a city coming to life. Here, the only sound was the gentle whisper of wind in the pine boughs outside his window and the slow, steady beat of his own heart. A lightness he had not felt in a very long time settled in his chest. This was what he had been seeking. This was the beginning of peace. He spent the morning in quiet contemplation, drinking black coffee on the porch as the sun climbed over the distant peaks, its rays cutting sharp, golden lines through the cool mountain air. He had no agenda, no schedule to keep, no emails to answer. The freedom was both exhilarating and slightly unnerving. By the afternoon, a restless energy began to stir within him. He needed to move, to feel the earth under his boots, to explore the vast, quiet world he had entered. He pulled on his sturdy hiking boots, checked the small pack he had prepared, with water, a compass, and a basic first aid kit, and set off towards a marked trail that began at the edge of the property. The path wound its way up a gentle slope, carpeted with a thick layer of rust-colored pine needles that muffled his footsteps. The air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the thick, exhaust-heavy air of Chicago. He walked for over an hour, letting the rhythm of his steps and the immensity of the forest wash over him, clearing away the mental clutter of his former life. It was on his way back, as the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, that he first heard it. A sound so faint, so out of place in the natural harmony of the woods, that he initially dismissed it as a trick of the wind. It was a whimper, a thin thread of pain that cut through the silence. Instantly the hiker vanished, and the pararescueman took over. Duke stopped dead, his body going still, his head cocked as he strained to listen. The sound came again, weaker this time, from somewhere off the trail, deeper in the dense undergrowth. His training took over, a familiar switch flipping in his mind. He scanned the area, noting landmarks, his relaxed posture replaced by a focused, economic grace. He moved off the path, pushing aside low-hanging branches, his steps deliberate and silent. He followed the sound for 50 yards, his eyes scanning the forest floor, and then he saw it. Lying at the base of a large granite boulder was a German shepherd. It was a magnificent animal, large and powerfully built, with a thick coat of silver, gray, and black fur. But its magnificence was marred by injury and exhaustion. Its fur was matted with dried blood and dirt. One side of its body was a mess of deep, parallel scratches, the kind of marks left by the claws of a large predator. A long, ugly gash tore across its left shoulder, still oozing blood. The snow and pine needles around it were stained dark red. The dog lifted its head weakly as Duke approached. Its amber eyes, intelligent and soulful, were clouded with pain. It made no move of aggression, no growl rumbled in its chest. It simply watched him, a low, exhausted whimper escaping its throat. It was a plea. "Easy there, boy," Duke said, his voice a low, calm murmur, the tone he had used countless times to soothe injured soldiers in far worse situations. "I'm not going to hurt you." He knelt slowly, keeping his movements predictable. The dog, which he now saw was a male, watched him, but did not flinch. Duke's trained eyes quickly assessed the damage. The claw marks were deep, a clear sign it had fought something big, probably a mountain lion. The shoulder wound was the most serious, the source of most of the blood loss. He gently ran his hands along the dog's legs and ribs, checking for fractures. He was relieved to find none. The animal was hurt badly, but its bones were intact. Leaving the dog here was a death sentence. The temperature would plummet after sunset, and in its weakened state, it would not survive the night. There was no choice. Duke knew what he had to do. "All right, let's get you out of here," he whispered. He shrugged off his heavy, canvas outer jacket. It was warm and durable, the best tool he had. He looked at the dog, estimating its weight. It was too heavy to carry in his arms for the distance back to the cabin, especially over uneven ground. He needed a stretcher. With practiced efficiency, he used his survival knife to cut 2 long, sturdy saplings. He laid them parallel on the ground and carefully spread his jacket between them, pushing the branches through the sleeves to create a makeshift travois, a simple drag sled. The task took him 10 minutes, his movements precise and unhurried. The hardest part was getting the dog onto it. "This might hurt a bit, buddy," Duke said softly, "but we have to move." He positioned the travois alongside the shepherd. Gently but firmly, he slid his arms under the animal's body, taking most of the weight on his shoulders and legs. The dog let out a sharp cry of pain, its body tensing, but it did not snap or struggle. It seemed to understand. With a final, focused grunt, Duke lifted and shifted the dog onto the jacket. The journey back was grueling. Duke gripped the ends of the 2 poles, leaning forward as he dragged the heavy load through the forest. The makeshift sled caught on roots and rocks, and he had to constantly stop to untangle it. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cooling air. His muscles, long unused to this kind of strain, burned with effort. The sun sank below the peaks, casting long, dark shadows that turned the forest into a labyrinth. Through it all, the dog remained silent, its shallow breaths the only sound from the sled. Several times Duke paused to check on it, to murmur words of encouragement. The great animal's eyes would meet his, a flicker of understanding, of trust, passing between them. Finally, utterly exhausted and covered in scratches, he saw the faint, welcoming light of the cabin through the trees. He pulled the sled the final few yards into the clearing and onto the porch. With the last of his strength, he carefully maneuvered the dog off the travois and through the door, settling it on the thick rug in front of the stone fireplace. The dog let out a deep sigh, its body finally relaxing in the warmth. Duke collapsed into an armchair, his own body aching, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His quiet, solitary retreat had lasted less than a day. He looked at the wounded, magnificent creature lying by his hearth, and knew, with absolute certainty, that his mission here had just begun. The first night was a long, quiet vigil. After cleaning the deep gashes on the German shepherd's body, as best he could with antiseptic wipes and warm water, Duke had bandaged the large tear on his shoulder with the most sterile dressing from his first aid kit. The dog, whom he had started calling Jax in his mind, had endured the painful process with a stoicism that stunned him. He had flinched and trembled, a low whine escaping his throat when the antiseptic touched raw tissue. But he never snapped, never showed a hint of aggression. He simply lay on the rug, his amber eyes fixed on Duke, a silent participant in his own rescue. That night set the tone for the days that followed. A new routine, unplanned and profound, took root in the isolated cabin. The next 10 days unfolded in a rhythm of care and quiet companionship. Duke's personal quest for solitude had been unexpectedly replaced by a mission a singular focus on the wounded animal he had taken responsibility for. Each morning, his first act upon waking was to check on Jax. He would kneel on the floor, speaking in a low, reassuring voice as he unwrapped the bandages to inspect the wounds for any sign of infection. The deep scratches were healing cleanly, but the gash on the shoulder remained a source of constant worry. After cleaning the area, he would apply a fresh dressing, his movements gentle and practiced. His own supplies, meant for a 2-week solo trip, were now shared between two. He had canned stew, rice, and dried meat. He would soften the jerky in hot water, creating a makeshift broth for Jax, and mix it with some of the rice. He ate the other half himself. It was a simple, repetitive diet, but it was sustenance. Every shared meal was an unspoken promise, a confirmation of the pact that had formed between them. On the 4th day, Duke's anxiety spiked. Jax's breathing became shallow, and his nose was hot and dry to the touch. A fever had set in. For 24 hours, Duke rarely left his side. He soaked cloths in cool water from the hand pump outside and gently laid them on the dog's head and neck. He sat by the fire through the night, watching the rise and fall of Jax's chest, a silent sentinel in the flickering darkness. He spoke to the dog constantly, his voice a low murmur filling the cabin. He told him about Chicago, about the noise, about the feeling of being unmoored. He told him about the Air Force, about the sky, about the sense of purpose he missed so terribly. He wasn't talking to a dog, he was talking to a fellow survivor. When the fever finally broke on the 5th morning, the wave of relief that washed over Duke was immense. He saw Jax lift his head and lap water from the bowl with renewed strength, and Duke felt a victory more profound than any he had experienced in his civilian life. It was in those quiet moments, in the shared space of healing, that the bond between them solidified. It was a connection forged not with words, but with gentle hands, shared meals, and a mutual understanding of pain. Jax, who had been a stranger just days ago, was now an essential part of his world. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet presence of another living soul. By the 8th day, Jax was strong enough to stand, his legs trembling but holding. Duke supported him as he took his first tentative steps, limping heavily but determined. By the 10th day, he could walk around the cabin and even venture onto the porch for short periods, his strength returning with visible speed. And that was when his behavior began to change. The restlessness started subtly. Jax would no longer lie peacefully by the fire for hours. He would rise, pace the length of the small cabin, and then go to the large window that faced north. He would stand there for an hour at a time, perfectly still, his body tense. He wasn't looking at the nearby trees or the squirrels chasing each other on the branches. His gaze was fixed on something far in the distance, a specific jagged mountain peak that dominated the northern skyline, its stony face streaked with snow. At first, Duke thought it was just a symptom of his trauma, but Jax's focus was too intense, too specific to be random. Then came the nudging. When Duke would sit in the armchair to read, Jax would approach, rest his great head on Duke's knee, and then push his snout gently but firmly against Duke's hand. It was not a request for affection. It was a prompt, an urging. After each nudge, Jax would look pointedly from Duke's face to the window, toward that distant, silent peak. "What is it, boy?" Duke would ask, stroking the dog's broad head. "What are you trying to tell me?" In response, Jax would whine, a low, guttural sound, full of a meaning Duke could not yet decipher. It was not a sound of pain, but of profound urgency. He would repeat the sequence again and again. Nudge, look at Duke, look at the mountain, whine. The message became clearer with each passing day. This magnificent animal, this survivor he had nursed back from the brink of death, was not just healing, he was preparing. He was trying to communicate a mission, and he was trying to tell Duke, in the only way he knew how, that he needed him to be a part of it. Duke would stand on the porch, the cold air biting at his skin, and stare at that mountain peak. His journey to find peace in solitude was over. A silent call to action had found him here, in the quietest place on earth. For 2 more days, Duke watched the silent ritual. Jax would spend hours by the window, his body a study in tense patience, his gaze locked on the distant mountain peak. The gentle but insistent nudging continued, a constant physical reminder of a question Duke could no longer ignore. His logical mind warred with a deeper instinct. It was absurd to think a dog could be leading him on a mission. It was a traumatized animal, likely associating that direction with the danger it had escaped. That was the simple, rational explanation. But Duke had spent years of his life relying on instincts, on reading nonverbal cues in high-stakes situations, and what he saw in Jax's eyes was not fear or confusion. It was purpose. It was a clear, unwavering certainty that reminded Duke of the best men he had ever served with, soldiers who could convey an entire plan with a single look. He had come to these mountains seeking a quiet escape from a life that felt hollow and meaningless. He had wanted to disconnect. Yet, in the unwavering gaze of this dog, he felt the pull of a connection so profound it overshadowed his own plans. It was a call to action, a clear objective in a life that had become a rudderless drift. On the 3rd morning, he stood on the porch, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, and watched as Jax stared at the peak, a low whine vibrating in his chest. Duke looked from the dog's determined profile to the formidable mountain. It was a formidable, unforgiving landscape of rock and ice. To venture into it, off-trail, was a serious undertaking. To do so, following an animal, was a leap of faith that bordered on madness. But he remembered the absolute trust Jax had shown him, lying wounded and helpless in the forest, allowing a stranger to tend to his injuries. Now, it was Duke's turn to return that trust. "All right, Jax," he said, the words seeming to hang in the crisp morning air. "I hear you, and I self." He walked back into the cabin, the decision made. The feeling that settled over him was not anxiety, but a calm resolve he had not felt since he had taken off his uniform. He finally had a mission. What followed was a display of disciplined efficiency. Duke transformed the cabin's main room into a staging area, laying out his gear on the floor with the methodical precision of a soldier preparing for a long-range patrol. He unrolled his topographic maps of the area, studying the contour lines of the mountains, trying to plot a potential route towards the peak Jax was so focused on. There were no trails leading in that direction. It was pure wilderness. He packed his large tactical backpack with meticulous care. First, the essentials for survival: a lightweight, all-season tent, a sub-zero sleeping bag, a water filter, and purification tablets. Fire starting kit, in a waterproof case, rope, a compass, and a GPS unit. He calculated his food supply, packing high-energy protein bars, dehydrated meals, and jerky for at least 4 days, adding a significant extra portion for Jax. He went through his medical kit, restocking it from the cabin's limited supplies, making sure he had extra gauze and antiseptic for Jax's still-healing wounds. He packed layers of clothing, preparing for the drastic temperature shifts of the high mountains. Finally, he retrieved the hunting rifle he had brought with him. He hadn't planned on hunting, but heading into the backcountry where Jax had clearly been attacked by a large predator without a means of defense was a foolish risk. He cleaned the weapon, checked the action, and packed a box of cartridges. Every action was deliberate, imbued with a gravity that spoke to his years of training. He was no longer a tourist seeking peace. He was an operator preparing for an unknown objective. Jax watched the entire process from his spot by the hearth. The dog seemed to understand everything. The anxious pacing stopped. He lay quietly, his head on his paws, his amber eyes following Duke's every move. A sense of shared purpose had settled over the cabin, thick and palpable. They left at dawn the next day. The air was sharp and cold, the sky a pale, clear blue. Duke shouldered the heavy pack, the familiar weight of comfort on his back. He slung the rifle over his shoulder. He looked down at Jax, who stood waiting by the door, his posture alert. The shepherd's limp was still noticeable, but his tail gave a single, hopeful thump against the doorframe. "Ready to lead the way, boy?" Duke asked. Jax responded with a soft bark and pushed the door open with his nose. They started out on the familiar trail, the same one where Duke had found him. But after less than a mile, Jax stopped. He looked back at Duke, then turned decisively to the left, stepping off the manicured path and into the dense, untracked forest. He paused, ensuring Duke was following. Duke took a deep breath and stepped off the trail after him. The undergrowth immediately closed in around them, the safety of the known world vanishing behind them. There were no signs, no markers, nothing but the vast, silent wilderness and the unwavering confidence of his four-legged guide. Ahead of them, through a break in the trees, the stony face of the distant mountain peak watched them like a silent, waiting sentinel. Their journey had truly begun. For 2 days they trekked deeper and higher into the wilderness. The landscape grew more severe, the trees thinning out as they ascended past the timberline. The air grew thin and sharp, each breath a conscious effort in the high altitude. Duke felt the burn in his lungs and the ache in his legs, but he pushed onward, his focus narrowed to the steady, determined pace of the dog in front of him. Jax was no longer the frantic, anxious animal from the cabin. His urgency had transformed into a solemn, unwavering purpose. He moved with a quiet dignity, his limp a testament to a battle fought and won, his gaze fixed on the rising terrain ahead. He was not just a guide, he was a pilgrim on the final leg of a sacred journey, and Duke was the acolyte he had chosen to bring with him. On the afternoon of the second day, Jax led him through a narrow pass between two massive stone buttresses. As they emerged on the other side, Duke stopped, his breath catching in his throat, and not just from the thin air. Before them lay a high alpine meadow, a gentle, windswept slope that opened up to a breathtaking panorama of the world below. Range after range of snow-capped peaks stretched to the horizon, the valleys between them filled with a soft, hazy light. The beauty was absolute, severe, and profoundly peaceful. The wind was the only sound, a high, thin whisper that seemed to carry the secrets of the ancient mountains. Duke understood instantly why someone would seek out this place. It felt like the top of the world, a place where the earth met the sky. He also felt the biting cold, a deep, penetrating chill that the sun could not touch. At this elevation, the cold was a constant, a force of nature that preserved all things in a state of suspended animation. Jax paused, letting Duke take in the scene. Then, with a soft whine, he turned and trotted toward a solitary, gnarled pine tree that stood at the very edge of the slope, its twisted branches a testament to its long battle with the elements. Duke followed, his eyes drawn to a figure sitting at the base of the tree. At first, he thought it was another hiker, someone resting and taking in the view. The figure was bundled in worn but durable outdoor clothing, a small pack resting beside him. He was sitting with his back against the tree's thick trunk, his head tilted slightly to the side, looking out over the magnificent vista. "Hello," Duke called out, his voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. He raised a hand in greeting. There was no response. The figure remained perfectly still. As Duke drew closer, a cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. The stillness was too absolute, too unnatural. He was now close enough to see the man's face. He was elderly, his features weathered and kind, his skin pale against a neatly trimmed white beard. His eyes were closed, and his face held an expression of profound peace, as if he were merely dozing in the faint afternoon sun. He looked for all the world like he was simply sleeping. But Duke, who had seen death in many forms, knew this was not sleep. This was the serene, final stillness that comes after the last breath has been taken. The scene was not gruesome or violent. It was heartbreakingly peaceful. The man had not died here by accident. He had come here to meet his end. This was Jax's owner. This was Bob. While Duke stood frozen, trying to process the tragic tableau before him, Jax walked forward. He moved without haste, his paws making soft sounds on the rocky ground. He approached the still figure of his master, circled the spot once, and then, with a long, slow exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of a world of sorrow, he lay down. He curled his great body at the man's feet, resting his head on the worn leather of his old hiking boots. His vigil was over. His mission was complete. He had kept watch over his master, and he had finally brought someone to this lonely, sacred place. Duke watched, his throat tight with an emotion he could not name. He was a witness to an act of love and loyalty so profound it transcended life itself. The wind whipped around him, pulling at his jacket, but he didn't feel the cold. All he could see was the magnificent German shepherd, finally at rest, a faithful guardian lying at the feet of the man he had refused to leave, even in death. Duke understood now. He had not been led here for a rescue. He had been brought here to bear witness and to take on the responsibility of a promise he was only just beginning to understand. Time seemed to stand still on the windswept slope. Duke remained a respectful distance from the peaceful scene, a silent observer in a sacred space. The wind was the only thing that moved, tugging at the collar of his jacket and whispering through the gnarled branches of the ancient pine. Jax did not stir from his place at his master's feet, his great body finally at rest, his long vigil complete. After several minutes that felt like an eternity, Duke knew he could not simply stand there. He had been brought here for a reason, and he felt a profound duty to understand the story that had led to this final, quiet moment. He approached slowly, his steps measured and soft. Jax lifted his head, his ears twitching, but he made no sound of protest. He simply watched Duke with those intelligent, knowing eyes, as if he understood and approved. Kneeling beside the still figure, Duke felt a sense of profound respect. This was not a scene of tragedy in the way he had known it. It was a scene of peace, of a final, deliberate choice. Next to the man's hip was a small, weatherproof pack. From an outer pocket, a transparent, waterproof bag was visible. Inside it, protected from the elements, was a simple, leather-bound journal. Duke's hand hesitated. To read a man's final thoughts felt like the ultimate intrusion. But then he looked at Jax, at the unwavering loyalty in the dog's gaze, and he understood. This journal was not meant to be a secret. It was a testament, a final communication left for whoever was worthy of finding it. Jax had chosen him. It was his duty to listen. He carefully removed the journal from the bag. The leather cover was worn smooth with time and use. He opened it, the pages stiff in the cold air. The handwriting inside was neat and strong, the script of an educated and thoughtful man, though it grew shakier in the final pages. He turned to the last dated entry and began to read. The words painted a picture of a life lived with quiet passion. The man's name was Bob. He had been a naturalist with the Park Service for over 40 years. He wrote not of accomplishments, but of moments. The sight of a bald eagle in flight, the scent of pine after a rain, the profound silence of a winter morning. And he wrote of Jennifer. His wife, Jennifer, had been the love of his life. This mountainside, he explained, was their sanctuary, the place they had come to celebrate anniversaries and to simply be together, away from the noise of the world. She had passed away 3 years prior, and her absence was a constant, gentle ache in his writing. Then, the tone of the journal shifted. An entry from 6 months ago detailed a doctor's visit, a diagnosis delivered in cold, clinical terms. A terminal cancer that had spread too far for any meaningful treatment. The doctors had offered him months of aggressive, painful therapy in a sterile hospital room that might extend his life, but not save it. Bob had made a different choice. He wrote, "Jennifer did not die in a hospital, and neither will I. I have lived my life in the arms of these mountains, and I will end it here, where I can still feel her beside me. I will not spend my last days fighting a war I cannot win. I will spend them walking towards a peace I have long known. It is hab.hem, and it septun as a, and it's a any 10. The final entries chronicled his last journey. He had prepared meticulously, putting his affairs in order and packing only what he needed. His one companion was Jax, his loyal friend of 8 years. He wrote of the beauty of the hike, of the clarity that came with knowing his time was short. The last entry was written in a scrawling, unsteady hand. It was dated just over 10 days ago. "The pain is worse now," it began, "but the beauty of this place makes it bearable. Something happened this morning. A mountain lion. Drawn by our scent, I suppose. It was young and bold. I was too weak to do anything but watch. But Jax, my brave, foolish, wonderful Jax. He put himself between me and the cat without a moment of hesitation. I have never seen such courage. He fought with a fury I did not know he possessed. He drove it off, but he is badly hurt. I have cleaned his wounds as best I can. He will not leave my side." Duke had to stop reading. He looked over at Jax, at the healing scars on his shoulder and flank, and his heart ached with a sudden, sharp intensity. The dog's injuries were not just wounds. They were medals of honor, earned in a final, desperate act of protection. He forced himself to read the final paragraph. "My time is very near now. My only regret is for Jax. He has been the best friend a man could ever ask for. He will stay with me until the end. I know it. It is my final wish that when his duty here is done, he will find a kind soul, someone who understands the heart of a loyal friend. I am not afraid. The sun is warm on my face. It feels like Jennifer is here, waiting for me. I am going home." Duke closed the journal, a single hot tear tracing a path down his cold cheek. He, who had thought himself numb to grief, was overwhelmed. He looked at the peaceful face of Bob, a man he had never met, but now felt he knew intimately. He looked at Jax, the hero who had stood guard over his friend, protecting him even in death. The sun was setting, painting the snow on the distant peaks in hues of orange and deep purple. The world was awash in a beauty so profound it was almost painful. Duke finally understood his own role in this silent, epic story. He was the kind soul Bob had hoped for. He was the answer to a dying man's last wish. As Duke placed the journal back into its waterproof bag, he noticed a sudden dramatic shift in the atmosphere. The wind, which had been a constant high whisper, began to keen with a lower, more menacing tone. The brilliant gold and purple hues of the sunset were rapidly being consumed by a wall of bruised gray clouds rolling in from the west. He had seen skies like this before in the mountains, a clear warning of a fast-approaching violent storm. There was no time to descend. The temperature was dropping precipitously, and the first hard pellets of snow began to sting his face. To be caught out in the open on this exposed slope during a blizzard was a death sentence. His survival training, dormant for years, surged to the forefront of his mind, clear and instinctive. "All right, Jax," he said, his voice sharp with purpose. "We need to move. We need cover." He scanned the immediate area, his eyes assessing the terrain with a practiced swiftness. The solitary pine tree, while offering some protection, was too exposed. He spotted a cluster of large granite boulders about 100 yards down the slope, forming a small, natural alcove. It wasn't perfect, but it was their best and only option. He gently placed a hand on Bob's shoulder. "I'm sorry, sir," he murmured. "We'll be back." He then turned to Jax, who had risen to his feet, sensing the urgency in Duke's tone. "Come on, boy. With me." In back. They moved quickly through the swirling snow, which was already beginning to reduce visibility. The alcove was a shallow U-shape, with one large, flat boulder acting as a partial roof. It would protect them from the worst of the wind. Using his hands and a flat piece of shale he found, Duke began to dig and scrape at the snow, deepening the space beneath the overhang. He worked with a frantic, focused energy, his body moving with an economy of motion honed by years of training. As he worked, Jack stood guard at the entrance to their makeshift shelter, his body a dark silhouette against the whitening world, his ears alert. The storm hit with full force, a raging torrent of wind and snow that blotted out the sky and the landscape. The world was reduced to the small space they had carved out of the mountainside. Once the space was as deep as he could make it, Duke unrolled his all-season tent from his pack. It was too windy to set it up properly, but he used the waterproof fly sheet, anchoring its corners with heavy rocks to create an additional barrier against the driving snow, effectively sealing the front of their alcove. Finally, shivering and exhausted, he crawled into the small, protected space. Jax followed, curling up beside him immediately. In the cramped darkness, the roar of the wind was a constant, deafening presence, but the driving snow could no longer reach them. Duke took out his flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp circle in the gloom. He checked on Jax, whose thick coat was dusted with snow. The dog was shivering, but he licked Duke's hand, a silent reassurance. There was nothing to do now but wait. Trapped in the roaring heart of the storm, the hours stretched into a long, dark eternity. The cold was a physical entity, seeping through their layers of clothing. Duke unpacked his sleeping bag, draping it over both of them. Jax pressed his body close, their shared warmth a small but vital bastion against the freezing temperatures. In that enforced stillness, with the fury of the natural world raging just inches away, Duke's own internal storm began to quiet. The constant low-grade anxiety that had been his companion for years seemed to recede, replaced by the simple, clear imperatives of survival. Here, there was no room for anything but the present moment. He pulled the leather-bound journal from his pack. In the steady beam of his flashlight, he began to read it again, this time from the very beginning. He read about Bob's childhood love for the outdoors, about his career as a naturalist, about the day he met Jennifer. He read about their life together, a simple tapestry woven with threads of deep love and a shared reverence for the wilderness. The story was not one of grand adventures, but of quiet moments that made up a life of profound meaning. Picnics on this very mountainside, watching the stars on clear summer nights, the simple comfort of holding hands by a fire. As he read, Duke felt the walls he had built around his own heart begin to crumble. He had spent so long running from his own pain, from the grief of losing comrades, from the guilt of surviving when others had not. He had equated emotion with weakness. But Bob's words were filled with an emotion so pure and unafraid, it was like a beacon. He wrote of his love for Jennifer with a clarity and strength that defied her absence. He wrote of his impending death not with fear, but with a calm acceptance that was born of a life fully lived. And he wrote of his love for his dog with a simple, profound tenderness. This man, a stranger, was teaching him what it meant to be truly strong. It wasn't about suppressing pain or outrunning the past. It was about facing it with an open heart. He looked at Jax, who was now sleeping fitfully, his paws twitching as he dreamed. This dog, this incredible creature, was the living embodiment of Bob's story. He was loyalty, courage, and unconditional love made manifest. He had fought a mountain lion and stood a lonely vigil for days, all for the love of his friend. The roar of the storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet power of the story held in his hands. The echoes of emptiness that had driven Duke to this mountain were finally being filled, not with the silence he had sought, but with the resonant, heartbreakingly beautiful story of a life and a love that had never truly ended. Trapped in a blizzard on the top of the world, Duke began, at long last, to find his way home. The blizzard raged for the better part of another day and night, its relentless fury trapping Duke and Jax in their small, rock-hewn sanctuary. Inside, nestled together for warmth, Duke finished reading Bob's journal. The words, penned by a man facing his final days with grace and courage, resonated deep within Duke's soul. He learned of Bob's simple joys, his profound love for Jennifer, and his unwavering appreciation for the natural world. He also reread the heart-wrenching account of Jax's valiant fight against the mountain lion, a testament to a loyalty that defied explanation. The storm's cacophony outside had become a distant hum, a backdrop to the more powerful silence that now filled Duke. The emptiness he had felt in Chicago, the void that had driven him to seek solace in solitude, was no longer a barren space. It was being filled with the echoes of Bob's life, with the quiet dignity of a man who chose how he would leave this world, and with the fierce, unyielding devotion of his dog. Jax, sensing Duke's shift in focus, stirred beside him. The German shepherd lifted his head, nudging Duke's hand with his wet nose, then rested his great head on Duke's lap, his amber eyes, clear and steady, meeting Duke's gaze. There was an unspoken question in those eyes, a silent plea for understanding, for direction. Duke gently stroked Jax's fur, feeling the warmth of the dog's body against his own. He looked at the dog, a creature who had endured unimaginable pain and a lonely vigil, all for the love of his master. He remembered Bob's final entry, the shaky script on the yellowed page. "My only regret is for Jax. He has been the best friend a man could ever ask for. It is my final wish that when his duty here is done, he will find a kind soul, someone who understands the heart of a loyal friend." The words hung in the air between them, a sacred trust passed from one man to another through the loyal heart of a dog. Duke realized, with a sudden profound clarity, that his journey to find purpose had indeed ended. It had ended here, in this cold, rock-hewn shelter, amidst the remnants of another man's life. But the ending of one journey was merely the beginning of another. He was the kind soul Bob had hoped for. He was the answer to a dying man's last wish. This wasn't a choice he could make. It was a destiny he had stumbled into. The emptiness that had once defined him was now replaced by a clear, unwavering sense of responsibility. Not a burden, but a privilege. "He wished for you to find a kind soul, didn't he, boy?" Duke whispered, his voice raspy with emotion. He scratched Jax behind his ears, and the dog leaned into his touch, a soft, contented sigh escaping him. "He wanted you to find someone who understands, someone who would take care of you." Jax responded with a deep, rumbling sound, a low rumble that resonated through Duke's chest. It was a sound of affirmation, of understanding, of a shared path. The dog had chosen him, not just to bring him here, but to take on the mantle of his protection, to complete the unfinished business of a life lived with such integrity. The thought of returning to Chicago, to the logistics job, to the sterile apartment, and the ceaseless noise now felt utterly impossible. That life felt like a ghost, a distant memory. This mountain, this cabin, this dog, this quiet promise to a man he had never met, this was his reality. Now, this was where he belonged. Duke had spent years running from the past, from the ghosts of his own service, from the overwhelming grief that had followed him home. He had sought solitude, believing it would be a balm for his wounded spirit. But solitude had only amplified the emptiness. It was in saving Jax, in listening to Bob's story, in accepting this unexpected responsibility, that he finally felt a flicker of the purpose he had so desperately yearned for. His mission was no longer about escaping himself. It was about embracing a new calling. It was about honoring the legacy of a man he respected, and about providing a home and a future for a dog whose loyalty was an inspiration he would see to Bob's final rest. He would care for Jax, and in doing so, he would finally begin to heal himself. He pulled Jax closer, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. The faint scent of pine needles and damp earth mingled with the clean smell of the dog. It was the smell of home. This unexpected detour in his life, this chance encounter with a wounded animal, had led him not to an escape, but to a profound connection. His journey to find purpose had not ended. It had just taken a turn he could never have predicted. It was a path towards a quiet, certain future, a future defined not by what he ran from, but by what he embraced. The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived. The roaring wind died down to a whisper, and a profound, crystalline silence descended upon the mountain. Duke pushed aside the snow-caked tent flap and crawled out of the shelter. The world was a blanket of pristine, untouched white, the fresh snow sculpted by the wind into soft, rolling drifts. The sun, bright in a now cloudless sky, made the landscape glitter with a light so intense it was almost painful to behold. He looked toward the ancient pine. Bob's final resting place was now a gentle mound of white, a peaceful, natural burial shroud. Duke stood for a long moment, a silent salute to the man he had never met. He made a quiet promise, a soldier's word of honor, that he would be back. Jax stood beside him, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The dog looked from the mound of snow to Duke, a clear, trusting understanding in his eyes. His part of the mission was over. He was now placing his faith entirely in Duke. The journey back was more arduous than the trek in. The deep, fresh snow concealed the treacherous terrain beneath, and each step was a struggle. Duke relied on his compass and his memory of the landscape, his body aching with exhaustion, but his mind clear and focused. Jax walked steadily at his side, no longer a guide, but a partner. They moved as a single unit, two survivors bound by a shared, sacred purpose. It took them the better part of the day to navigate their way back to the relative safety of the rental cabin. Duke's first priority was Jax. He checked the dog's wounds, which had thankfully not reopened, and gave him the last of the food. Only then did he allow himself to collapse into a chair, the deep, bone-weary exhaustion finally settling over him. The next morning, they drove the truck back down the winding gravel road and into town. The transition was jarring. After days in the profound silence of the high mountains, the sounds of the small town, a passing car, the murmur of conversation, felt loud and intrusive. Duke parked in front of a simple, single-story building with a sign that read, County Sheriff. He took a deep breath, placed Bob's journal securely in his jacket pocket, and walked inside, Jax healing perfectly at his side. The man behind the desk was in his mid-50s, with a weathered face, shrewd, intelligent eyes, and a calm demeanor that suggested very little could surprise him. A simple nameplate read, Sheriff Miller. He looked up from his paperwork, his gaze taking in Duke's disheveled appearance and the large, calm German shepherd standing beside him. "Can I help you?" Sheriff Miller asked, his voice neutral. "Yes, Sheriff," Duke began, his own voice steady. "My name is Duke. I need to report a death." "It is settled." For the next 20 minutes, Duke recounted the entire story, starting from the moment he had found Jax on the trail. He spoke clearly and factually, omitting no details, presenting the events as they had happened. Sheriff Miller listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Duke finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "That's quite a story, son," he said, his tone still neutral but laced with a professional skepticism. "You're telling me you followed a stray dog, a dog you'd just found, miles into the backcountry, off-trail?" "Yes, sir," Duke replied. "And you found this man, Bob, who just happened to die peacefully of natural causes, despite his dog being mauled by what you think was a mountain lion?" "That is what happened, Sheriff. And how do I know this isn't just some story you concocted? How do I know there was no foul play involved?" Duke understood the man's position. The story was improbable, bordering on unbelievable. A stranger, a veteran with his own unseen scars, shows up with a tale of a dead naturalist and a heroic dog. It was the kind of story that demanded proof. He did not get angry or defensive. He simply met the sheriff's steady gaze. "Because he left this," Duke said. He reached into his pocket and carefully placed the leather-bound journal on the desk. His name was Bob. He was a good man, and he wrote everything down. It had 4. Sheriff Miller picked up the journal. He handled it with a certain reverence, as if sensing its importance. He opened it to the last few pages, his eyes scanning the shaky but clear script. Duke watched as a subtle change came over the sheriff's face. The hard lines of professional doubt softened into something else, a quiet understanding, a somber respect. He read for a long time, the only sound in the office the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, he closed the journal and looked up. His eyes were different now. The skepticism was gone. "I'll be," he said, his voice now gentle. "Old man Bob, I knew of him. He and his wife Jennifer used to come into town for supplies years ago, kept to himself after she passed. So that's what happened to him." He looked from the journal to Duke, and then to Jax, who was sitting patiently at Duke's feet. "This journal confirms everything you said. His last wishes are perfectly clear." But the sheriff picked up his phone and began making calls, his voice now crisp and official, coordinating with the Forest Service and the county coroner for a recovery mission. The investigation was over before it had even truly begun. The truth, in all its sad and beautiful detail, was undeniable. When he hung up, he looked at Duke. According to this, Bob left everything, which isn't much besides his old truck and his personal effects, to whoever found this journal and agreed to care for his dog. He gestured toward Jax. "That dog is your responsibility now, son. Officially." A wave of profound relief and solemn purpose washed over Duke. He had completed his mission. He had honored his promise. He reached down and placed a hand on Jax's head. The dog looked up at him, his tail giving a single, slow wag. "I understand, Sheriff," Duke said. "Thank you." He left the journal as evidence and walked out of the office, Jax at his side. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. Their future was now officially, irrevocably intertwined. The difficult journey was over, but a new one, a lifetime of shared loyalty, was just beginning. The days following the return from the mountain were a blur of somber duties. Duke led Sheriff Miller and a team of park rangers back to the windswept slope, a difficult journey made with a shared sense of reverence. They brought Bob's body back with the dignity he deserved. Duke stood by as the small town's simple services were performed, a quiet stranger paying his final respects to the man who had unknowingly changed the course of his life. Through it all, Jax was a constant, steady presence at his side. The dog seemed to understand the solemnity of the proceedings, remaining quiet and watchful, his gaze often drifting towards the northern peaks. The last of Bob's affairs were settled quickly. His will was as simple and direct as the life he had led. His few possessions and a modest savings account, carefully set aside over a lifetime, were left to the kind soul who would agree to care for his beloved Jax. With the legalities settled, Duke found himself at a crossroads. The lease on his rental cabin was ending. His truck was packed. The long, straight road back to Chicago, back to the noise and the emptiness, was waiting. He sat on the cabin's porch on his final evening, Jax's great head resting on his knee. He looked at the life waiting for him in the city, a life of comfort and stability, and felt nothing but a profound sense of dread. Then he looked at Jax, at the unwavering trust in the dog's eyes, and at the mountains that had become a place of revelation rather than escape. He pulled out his phone. The first call was to his landlord in Chicago. The second was to his boss. The conversations were short and polite. He was not extending his vacation. He was not coming back. As he ended the final call, a feeling of terror and liberation washed over him in equal measure. He had just untethered himself from the only life he knew. He was no longer running from something. He was staying for something. The last of the winter snows melted, giving way to the tender green shoots of a Colorado spring. Duke, using his own savings, combined with the small inheritance from Bob, did not rush. He and Jax lived for a few weeks in a small rented room in town. He spent his days exploring the area, not as a tourist, but as a man searching for a place to put down roots. He found it on a gently sloping parcel of land just outside of town, a few acres of meadow and pine with a clear, breathtaking view of the jagged peak where his journey had truly begun. Months passed in a blur of meaningful work. The man who had once managed logistics from behind a computer screen now worked with his hands, learning the rhythms of the earth and the satisfaction of honest labor. He cleared the land, poured a foundation, and began to build. The story ends on a warm afternoon in late summer. The frame of a small, sturdy log house stood proudly in the meadow, the scent of fresh-cut pine hanging in the air. Duke, his arms tanned and strong from months of work, hammered a final nail into a roof beam. He was tired, his muscles ached, but it was a good, clean exhaustion. It was the feeling of building, not of enduring. Jax lay in a patch of sun nearby, his silver and black coat gleaming. His wounds had long since healed into faint, silver scars, badges of honor from a battle fought and won. He watched Duke with a calm, contented gaze, a loyal partner overseeing their shared project. Duke set down his hammer and wiped the sweat from his brow. He looked at his calloused hands, at the simple, strong home rising from the earth, at the magnificent dog who was now his family. He had come to these mountains seeking silence, an escape from the echoes of his past. He had thought peace was an absence of noise, an emptying of the soul. He had been wrong. Peace was not an empty space. It was a space filled with purpose. It was the satisfaction of a hard day's work. It was the quiet companionship of a loyal friend. It was the knowledge that he was no longer adrift, but anchored to a place and a life of his own making. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, Duke sat down on the edge of the unfinished porch. Jax padded over, resting his great head on Duke's knee. Together, they looked out at the majestic landscape. Duke's eyes found the familiar, distant peak. It was no longer a mysterious destination or a place of sorrow. It was a landmark of his own history, a monument to a good man, and the starting point of his own healing. He had not found peace by running away from the world. He had found it by creating a new one for himself and the faithful companion who had led him there. In the quiet of the coming twilight, surrounded by the home they were building together, Duke was finally at peace. Duke's story reminds us that sometimes the path to healing our own hearts is not found in solitude, but in the profound purpose of honoring a promise and caring for a loyal friend. If this tale of loyalty and new beginnings resonated with you, we would be honored if you shared your thoughts in the comments below. Your support, through a simple like or by sharing this story with someone who might appreciate it, helps us continue our mission. Please consider subscribing to join our community. And now, another journey awaits you in the video that has just appeared on your screen.